Good afternoon. My name is John Ragasta. I'm a historian here at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello. And we're so happy that you could join us today for this Fellows Forum with Laura Sandys. Dr. Sandys is a professor of history and the history of slavery in particularly at the University of Liverpool. She's the director of the Center for the Study of International Slavery at Liverpool. And she has done amazing work on not only the slave community, around the slave community. And I see we've been joined by our director, Andrew O'Shaughnessy. Andrew, if you would like to introduce Laura.
Right. I don't know how that happened, but I never got a link from anyone. So in any case, thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to our guests. My name is Andrew O'Shaughnessy. I am the Saunders Director of the Robert H. Smith Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and fellow in residence, Laura Sandy, who's Associate Professor in History and Slavery for the Center of the Study of International Slavery at the University of Liverpool. Top qualified women, the role of non-elite and enslaved women on Jefferson and Washington's plantations. Laura is author of Early American Overseers, Supervisors, Enslaved Laborers, and the Plantation Enterprise, returning fellow, and she was on a conference in Liverpool in 2018 on capitalism and slavery. Please join me in welcoming Laura Sandy.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and it's so nice to be back in Charlottesville. We had a long break in Europe, 20 months away from us, so it's nice to be here, and thank you for mentioning my book that came out during COVID, in fact, so it was interesting when I celebrated with very few people. I'm really happy to be back in the archive, and thank you for joining us today to hear my talk. As Andrew said, it's about clever, industrious, and well-qualified women, the role of non-elite and enslaved women on Jefferson and Washington's plantations. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you, and then we'll start. Okay, so here we are. I'm just going to move myself into the corner so I can see my screen. So the project I'm currently researching is a comparison of management systems and all those involved in labour, enslaved and free, at Mount Vernon and Monticello, and on any lands and properties owned by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. This involves examining the economic and social roles of the numerous free hired workers and indentured servants, and looking at their part in the development of large plantation businesses and how they worked alongside and supervised enslaved labourers. The project stems from my recent book that Andrew just mentioned, Overseers of Early American Slavery, Supervisors, Enslaved Labourers, and the Plantation Enterprise. What I'm researching at Monticello right now is part of this project. The research focuses on women, and this is I guess, probably for me, the most exciting part of the project, and I'll come on to why shortly, and it's a much expanded part of my book project. I only wrote a chapter on women, on overseers' wives in my book, which I regret a little bit. I'm sure the people who read the draft, like Professor Emily West, who's joining us today and is also a fellow, are glad that I didn't write anymore. But so what do I mean by these women? And I've sort of said it in the title, but I'll just be clear from the start. What I mean is not the elite or wealthy women who lived at Monticello or visited or lived near Monticello. I mean the numerous married and single, free, indentured and servant women. Not Slaves, obviously servants, white servants, these people who worked and lived across Jefferson's estate, but are almost invisible. These women, like their male counterparts, worked alongside enslaved people and sometimes supervised them. For example, overseers' wives were in regular contact with free white elites and the enslaved, and at the moment, they have an untold story to tell. They've rarely been accorded more than a footnote or a passing comment in histories, and I'll demonstrate this shortly. They're not really featured in exhibitions or educational resources. Free and indentured women lived and worked on plantations, but they're hidden, even though they performed many tasks, not just in their own homes, but beyond that, that helped the plantation to function. So, in my view, they played an important part in the development of the plantation enterprise itself, in particular over the 18th century. Many of these women were skilled and can be classed as female artisans or craftswomen. And the quote from the title, clever, industrious, and well-qualified women who receive the least coverage need much more serious attention. Researching them is tricky, as they often appear only fleetingly in the records. Like many people in this era, they are not often deemed worthy of comment by the literate. Most of these women were, of course, themselves illiterate, so their own voices are almost impossible to reach. However, I'm still very much behind Rhys Isaac's view that actions must be viewed as statements. And we can certainly detect some action in the records and testimony. So there's a little, I guess, recap of the broad project. And then where I got some of these, I guess, quotes, advertisements, colonial, and then into the 19th century advertisements for overseers and other women and artisans, mentioning women as important to the package. So, as I said, we can certainly detect some action in the records and the testimony that we have available. And these women were not always clever or industrious, and sometimes these women were badly behaved or involved in the cruelties of slavery. And these women are covered in the projects, of course, too. These women, of course, I guess, get more coverage for their antics than those who are working industriously, seemingly behind the scenes. So recovering the lives and making all of them visible in American history will cast fresh light on plantation slavery and, I believe, on the experiences of the enslaved. So before I get on to discussing these women and those that I've found already at Monticello and Mount Vernon, I'm going to give you a very quick overview as context of the key themes of my book, which are linked to this newer project, so you have an idea of where I'm heading. The first project was actually comparative, so it was reviewing the development of slavery, overseeing, and the plantation enterprise in South Carolina as well as Virginia. It's just a breakdown of my book contents. Of course, please do buy it and read it. It's riveting, or I think it is. A full chapter there on respecting wages and privileges should cure insomnia if you don't want to read 25,000 words before you go to bed, but tells us a lot about agricultural change. And of course, women feature here too. So what did I find in a nutshell? Many overseers were more highly qualified or skilled than previously recognized. First of all, overseers, free, enslaved, and female, took part in a broad range of activities on the plantation. And so I put some up there for you to look at while I'm speaking. I'll move on. I split this into the categories of the careful overseer, slave management. They're often required to be careful, men and women in their supervision of plantations and the enslaved. We can think about whether that's accurate in terms of some of the plantation violence. And then the careful overseer, also not just with regard to slave management, but all these other duties here that are involved in overseeing as an agriculturalist and the part of it that is about estate management. So the job itself expanded or developed over the 18th century as large slave plantations diversified and transformed into dynamic and ruthless profit maximizing businesses. Along with the economic and agricultural change came complex human relationships that developed in tandem. These have not been fully unpacked. However, I have to say, at Monticello, I think you've done a good job, of course, of starting to explore some of this complexity, in particular in the online resources and some of the newer exhibits at Monticello. A variety of people became overseers for short stints, and others became overseers for a long time. There were long-term professionals, local smaller scale planters or farmers, and their son and kin. These men used overseeing as a stopgap, hopefully on their way to independence and prosperity. Overseers were sometimes slave owners who brought their enslaved people to the plantation with them. Others were the sons of wealthy planters, learning about plantation management from their father's neighbors' plantations or nearby plantations, where they were doing a sort of gentleman apprenticeship. We also have ship's captains, sailors, teachers, surveyors, doctors, and preachers involved in overseeing at different points. The artisan as I've termed it here, so experienced artisans and craftspeople worked as overseers. As I said in my book, I've termed this the artisan overseer, and I've applied this to this next project as well. They sometimes arrived as apprentices, some themselves were apprentices, and others were indentured servants. Rather than simply local men, overseers were drawn from a variety of locations: regional, national, so north and south, and international. Overseers came from the Caribbean and from Europe, and the latter was sometimes in high demand. Hired workmen and indentured servants were sometimes drawn into overseeing positions too. So here's a few migrants from Europe. Again, I'll come back to this with regard to women who migrated across the Atlantic. So overseers, as we can see, were also drafted from the ranks of the enslaved. Very early on in my research, I encountered Davy Gray, the enslaved man who worked as an overseer for Washington for over 30 years. But the enslaved couples and families acting as supervisory teams like Morris and Hannah and Will and Kate, not of the royal family, of course, at Mount Vernon, and well known at Monticello, Ursula, Great George, and their son, George Jr., formed what you could say are enslaved supervisory teams. Cinda Stanton and Mary Thompson have done brilliant research at Monticello and Mount Vernon, and they've made the lives of the enslaved over the last couple of decades really prominent and accessible. And I've really appreciated both their help and the amazing work they've done. However, the part overseers or artisan overseers, enslaved or free, have played needs more investigation. In particular, I think enslaved overseers. And it doesn't just need investigation, it needs to be incorporated into these histories. And it needs to be highlighted. So finally, coming to my focus of my visit to Monticello this July, while researching my book, I found wives of overseers and hired women referred to as clever, active, industrious women by planters. However, it led me to think about what other women were doing on the plantation. I saw lots of different Mrs. This or a woman's name in the account books as I was looking for overseers' wives who appeared to live on plantations or be there for a period of time or even come and do casual work. So what I want to expand in this project is not just looking at their supervisory roles, but their skilled roles too. In fact, many, if not most, overseers had wives from my research, and as I didn't do as much on Jefferson for my book because I ended it at the end of the 18th century, I'll show you how many I found shortly. So it's clear to me that there are many people who populated slave plantations, but who are still missing in the histories. Adding them as new characters to the casts sheds light on daily or regular encounters that have, good or bad, or simply transactional, been passed over or omitted. Including these encounters that have not been imagined even, will both broaden our understanding of how large slave plantations worked and tell us more about the experience of enslaved people. Now, just for a moment, before I start talking about these women, I just want to say I feel very lucky being here and visiting Mount Vernon, but lucky really because there are many, many online digital resources available. So the slavery database, which is at the Mount Vernon Center for Digital History, at the Washington Library. At Monticello, there's a vast array of resources such as slavery at Monticello, the Thomas Jefferson Encyclopedia, the DAX database of archaeological finds and reports, and hopefully I'm going to be talking to some of the archaeologists tomorrow morning about their work. And of course, last but not least, the groundbreaking Getting Word African American Oral History Project. These resources have helped me a lot, and many other scholars and academics and people just coming to Monticello to research perhaps their family history or just out of interest. And these certainly, all these resources helped with the work I'm doing right now. So in 1976, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, sorry, I often get her surname the wrong way around, even though I've met her several times and got her name wrong. So Laurel Thatcher Ulrich said in not 17, she'd be very old, in 1976, well-behaved women seldom make history. And obviously this is a very, very famous statement. Since the 1790s, then, not the 1790s, since the 1970s, getting confused with the 18th century and the 20th century. Since the 1970s, some research has been done into the history of women in the South. Research has been done into elite and slave-owning women who lived on plantations. Some great work and efforts, of course, have been made recently to research the experience of enslaved women. And obviously this work is brilliant, and we'll have Professor Emily West, who's also a fellow at Monticello, talking about this to you next week. So a little work has been done on women in towns and cities of the North, though here I would note very little has been done on free Black women. And in 1979, Lorena Walsh and Lois Carr wrote an excellent article entitled "The Planter's Wife, the Experience of White Women in 17th Century Maryland," which looked at the wives of smaller scale planters and slave owners. Nevertheless, we are in 2022, and many of the women who clearly populated the plantation landscape and the surrounding communities, the women Laurel Thatcher Ulrich alerted to us to nearly 50 years ago, are entirely absent from the historiography and popular presentations of this era and of American slavery. Yet they played a variety of roles on the plantation. They contributed to their own households, as I said, the planter household, and to the larger plantation economy. Those who were married were not simply wives, they were individuals too. Other women that appear in the archives were single or unmarried women. All these women's experiences that offer entirely new insights into plantation slavery should be studied. Though brief, they regularly feature in the written record, particularly account books, and occasionally in oral histories. Including these missing women thus presents us with an opportunity to rethink the narrative of plantation slavery and the array of experiences of the free and the enslaved at these sites of enslavement. While some planters complained about women and families as extra mouths to feed and were worried or wary about employing men with families for the cost or the disruption, most could see the social and economic benefits, and they've advertised for them and talk about them in their letters. So as you can see from the slide, a skilled, hard-working wife was a desirable and valuable asset on a multifaceted plantation enterprise. It's clear that women, as well as men, supervised and trained the enslaved in certain work. The records show that they frequently took on responsibility for areas requiring management, such as the dairy, livestock, the garden, and textile operations. Women took part in the production of items for use and consumption on the plantation and for sale beyond. They cooked and catered for other hired labourers. Health and welfare of the enslaved was a constant concern, if only to maintain high production. Planters required women who were clever in the care of sick slaves. You see the advert there. And again, this was an extremely valuable role, bearing in mind the cost of having the doctor to a plantation or to visit. Those who could act as midwives were incredibly valuable too. Some, like Eleanor Violet at Mount Vernon, had their role formalized in their husband's employment contract. So if you see there, I'm not sure, I've kind of pulled some of the quotes out. You probably can't read that document on the screen. If you have excellent vision. The contract said that the said Edward's wife, her husband was named Edward, was expected to milk, churn, and do necessary services at the dairy. An enslaved woman would assist her, and for her trouble and management, that's in quotes, specifically referred to as management, she was, in quotes, to be allowed 1/4 part of the butter. In other fleeting mentions of Mrs. Violet, it's clear that she was also being paid not just for her work in the dairy, but for other management of activities such as raising produce and spinning. Indeed, many planters recognise the advantages that could be gained by fostering husband-wife managerial partnerships. And Jefferson makes a touching comment on Bacon's wife, which I'll read out to you, around this notion of the partnership. Now to an example of the problem of researching this history and perhaps some solutions. There are only a few references to Elizabeth Alton, an overseer's wife in Washington's records. However, combining this with what we know of her husband, John Alton, and then searching terms that relate to the expectations and experiences and roles women played allows us to produce a short biography, one that makes it clear that Elizabeth Alton was more than just a man's widow. As you can see there, the disappointing entry I found when I clicked on this and thought, oh, there's going to be lots and lots about this woman. So you don't need to read it on the screen. I'm going to read this out. Elizabeth Alton was the wife of John Alton and the mother of Anne Alton, later Anne Burnett Walker. Elizabeth met John, her husband, after he served with Washington in the army, in the Continental Army in the American Revolution. Actually served with Washington before that. So they had a long-term friendship. So as soon as she married Alton, she moved to Mount Vernon and lived and worked alongside her husband, who was a servant and an overseer for George Washington between 1755 and 1785. Elizabeth and John and their daughter lived on several farms during their time as an overseeing family. They moved from one farm in spring 1762 to another to replace an overseer who had run away. And this was a swift move, so suddenly uprooted and moved somewhere else in a day or two. Elizabeth and her family then moved to Muddy Hole Farm in the fall of the same year when her husband took over as overseer from Edward Violet and his wife, Eleanor Violet, who left the plantation to set up as farmers. In 1767, Elizabeth tended to her husband, who was incapacitated with ague, I think that's how you say it, an illness that affected many enslaved and free people in the 18th century who lived on plantations. Over the ensuing years, the Altons would also live, work, and manage production and the lives of the enslaved at the Mill Plantation and the River Farm. So they lived across 5 plantations, and I think they moved 6 times. Elizabeth outlived her husband after being married, living together and working together and raising a family at Mount Vernon. She tended to him during his 4-month illness in 1785, during which time he was often in, quotes, great danger and personally visited not just by the doctor, again, which would have been costly, but by George Washington, the revolutionary nation's hero himself. In front of her eyes, her husband of 3 decades was, in quotes, in Jefferson's, Washington's words, reduced to a mere skeleton and died on the 4th of December, 1785. Her daughter married John Walker Burnett, who had worked as a butler at Mount Vernon. After her husband Elizabeth remained at River Farm, after her husband's death, Elizabeth herself remained at River Farm and continued to live on Washington's lands. Washington paid Elizabeth her deceased husband's share of the crop he had earned the year he died, and continued to subsidize her until her own death. Between 1785 and 1787, against her account were charges for a gun, 2 barrels of condemned flour, and several payments of cash from Washington to Elizabeth. The last record of Elizabeth Alton at Mount Vernon was in September 1792, when Washington noted in his accounts that he bought 6 chickens from her. So this summary tells us much more. It gives us a sense of Elizabeth's life on the plantation. It hints at the part she played and the encounters that may have passed between Elizabeth Alton and the enslaved and other people living on the plantation. So at Monticello, at times we encounter the same problem. So I've been looking through overseers and workmen records to find their wives. And Mrs. Bailey, like Mrs. Alton, has been consigned to being simply a widow too. So you can see there the mentions of her when you click on Robert Bailey. Yet there are traces of her life in the records, which combined with our broader knowledge and, dare I say it, our imaginations, can be used to fill in some of the blanks and to understand women like Mrs. Bailey and their part in the world of plantations and slavery. So for Washington then, I've done a fair bit of research, and there are currently over 50 names of what I've called other women, because there was a conference called Washington's Women, and it didn't mention any non-elite women, really. So Washington's other women, I have 50 or more that I'm constructing the lives of, and I obviously need to do a lot more investigation while I'm here at Monticello to get to that level. But what I have found in the last couple of weeks, I've done it slightly differently here, is the married men that we can find in the records and the missing women. I don't know if you can see that. The screen is there. That I've displayed. So everyone who's highlighted in yellow has a wife who I am investigating at the moment. There's one person who's highlighted in blue because he does have a wife. I haven't quite worked out if they got married before or after they came to the plantation. And a similar, I've got a date confusion with Hugh Petit there as to if he's married at the time or if it's just very close. So a quick look then at one of the overseers of Anne Bacon, and I will mention a few other women and come to some concluding thoughts. So Mrs. Anne Bacon might be a more well-known example at Monticello due to the prominence of her husband, Edmund Bacon, who was a head overseer. Anne does not really receive much coverage, but again, we can start to piece her life together if we use these different techniques and records. The task was made a little confusing at the start, and I did have a chat with another fellow about how everyone has got the same name, and it was made particularly confusing at the start because Mrs. Anne Bacon was known as Miss Nancy Simmons when she married Edmund. So perhaps Anne was short for Nancy or Nancy Anne. Somebody might be able to tell me. But more confusingly, Edmund's second wife was also called Nancy, Nancy Smith Henry. So it was by chance, in fact, that I noticed another woman in the records named Anne with Nancy in brackets at the side, which cleared up my confusion with some of the records. Anyway, Anne and Edmund Bacon were born in Virginia and were married in October 1802. Anne Bacon was 2 years older than her husband, and she was aged 23 when she moved to Monticello to become an overseer's wife. At this time, she had 2 infants. They were both sons, 1-year-old Thomas and 2-year-old boy named Fielding. She may have also been pregnant when she moved there, or she fell pregnant within her first year at Monticello, and she gave birth to her 3rd son, William, at their new home at Monticello. Mrs. Anne Bacon brought up her 3 sons at Monticello, and they lived there in 1820, and at that time they were aged, as you can see, 16, 15 and 13. Aside from her sons, Anne Bacon's household by 1820 included 9 enslaved people. It's not quite clear how many enslaved people they had when they moved to Monticello, if any at all. I'm sure I can find out when I've done a bit more research. So it's likely that she supervised, of course, her own household at times and enslaved people. Some may have been hired to Jefferson, again, which we can probably find out in the records. She would have supervised activities like domestic farming, gardening, and work in her household. 2 of the enslaved people that lived in this household were women, 5 were girls, and 2 were enslaved boys aged 4 and 7. So again, a young group of enslaved people that Mrs. Bacon would have been in charge of, or even helping to bring up alongside her own family. Anne Bacon was paid for spinning on the same terms as other wives, and she would have constantly been in close contact with the enslaved and those hired by Jefferson. She also raised poultry and hogs and produced vegetables, which were sold to her employers. And probably they were sold to other families at Monticello and on nearby plantations. And these female trading networks need to be investigated a bit more. And I put up a page from Martha Jefferson's 18th century account book, which is accessible online because it's a great demonstration. I've talked about this in my book of female networks of overseers' wives, white women, servants, indentured women, enslaved overseers' wives, or supervising enslaved women, all trading and working together. Anne Bacon remained living at Monticello with her husband until he left his job at the end of 1822, when she was 39 years old. They thought about moving to Missouri. They tried to buy land in Virginia, but by 1823, Anne and Edmund decided they would leave overseeing and Virginia and move to Trigg County, Kentucky, where they successfully started a farm. In 1825, at aged 41 or 42 years old, Anne died in Salem, Kentucky. And this is where her story ends. Jefferson's daughters were remembered to have had happy times at the Bacon home and when they visited Mrs. Bacon's house at Monticello. And perhaps as testimony to this, her work at Monticello and the couple's relationship, Jefferson, in a letter to Edmund Bacon shortly after Anne's death, commented, and this is a quote, "I sincerely condole you on the severity of the loss of your good partner, and will add no more to remind you of it, because I have learned in the school of experience that time and silence are the only remedies for these afflictions of the heart." So quite sentimental for somebody who loved counting and mapping things. Furthermore, my preliminary investigations into Mrs. Bacon and other overseers' wives highlights more missing women, as you can see from the inventory. The wives of workmen and single or independent labouring and skilled women who were hired and paid for their work and were clearly a part of the plantation economy. And we can reconstruct these women too, and this is what I've been trying to do very slowly. So as you can see, as I said in the inventory, there are two other families listed there, and we have Mary Meeks and Mrs. Carden. So I'll just tell you a little bit about them, and then I'm going to move on to sort of one final category of women. So Mary Meeks was married to a carpenter named Edward Meeks. They were born in Virginia and moved onto Monticello in 1819 when Jefferson employed 27-year-old Edmund Meeks as head carpenter. Mary was 21 or 22-year-old at the time, and she was either pregnant or had a newborn baby boy with her. The couple also owned an enslaved woman who was 20 years old in 1820. However, her name was not listed, and I have not discovered this yet. They lived and worked there until 1823. Mrs. Meeks' husband was paid an annual wage of £600 pork and £45, which would have made the Meek family or Mrs. Meeks' household more prosperous than some overseers and hired labourers at the time. I've not yet traced how long they were living and working on Jefferson's land. However, Mary Meeks and her family were still in Albemarle County in 1830, but had moved in 1840 to, I think it's called Allegheny County, again, a Virginian can correct me on this, and by 1850 to Monroe County, where Mr. Meeks died. More research should hopefully present a fuller picture of Mary Meeks. It is also possible to construct a similar biography for Mrs. Carden too. I'm not going to do it in such detail now, who moved to Shadwell Plantation in 1804 at the age of 46 to live at the mill. I'll give you a little overview to make a few points about these women. She and her husband, who was a miller and a Revolutionary War veteran, and her 4 children and 1 enslaved woman lived there for nearly 15 years until 1824. Aside from raising poultry and produce for sale, Mrs. Carden was also paid for cooking for the visiting workmen. And there's a picture that's quite well known on the Monticello website of the house that temporary or casual hired workmen and labourers stayed. So she was paid for cooking for these men. Like many other couples, their children would have grown up on the plantation too, encountering the enslaved as toddlers, as young children and as teenagers, and vice versa, of course. Also, the records show that some of these children in these families, these white families, free and indentured, when they became young adults, intermarried. We have no discussion of these networks and relationships in our plantation histories. And finally, it's interesting that Mrs. Carden's first name is not recorded by Edmund Bacon. This may not be striking, and anyone who knows me knows I really struggle with remembering anyone's name, so perhaps Edmund Bacon had the same problem. However, it could suggest that the Cardens living over 5 miles away at Shadwell Plantation had less contact with other families at Monticello or on other plantations. So mapping where they lived, their movements, centres of population, as well as looking at topography and environment, is also important for understanding these women's lives and social and economic interactions. And again, the DAX work will be very helpful for this. Anyway, with a little research, these women, as I hope you can see, who are mentioned on a one-page inventory and only mentioned in snippets across the records, have already become more than just widows and mothers. One of my most interesting discoveries of this project so far highlights a similar but slightly different category or group of women, which is where I will finish today. Women who arrived at places like Monticello and Mount Vernon as indentured servants. When I first arrived at Mount Vernon, luckily I was not indentured, but I was very tired and I kept waking up really, really early most days for over a week because of the time difference. This doesn't always happen. I slept like a baby when I arrived at Monticello. Maybe it's the mountain air. What I did before the library opened was I went for walks around Mount Vernon because as a fellow I could have access before it was open to the public. And one day I had a good look at the smokehouse. Long days and much research necessitates plenty of eating, and I love cheese. So I also went to the Mount Vernon shop and bought myself some food, including George Washington's cheese box. And I even took a photo of it. This was to send to my mum, but it's come in useful, bearing in mind what I thought about a bit later. So the box contained some smoked cheese, which at first I thought was an odd choice, but then I remembered the smokehouse and the information about Washington's efforts to make cheese as another part of his plantation enterprise. However, one important person in this history was not mentioned at all. I remembered something as I ate the cheese, not literally, but a little while later, from research that I'd been doing into looking into indentured women on the plantation, in particular those who'd come from Europe. And I realized there was a connection and an unsung hero in the story of Mount Vernon and cheese. Margaret Overdonk, a Dutch or German woman who moved with her husband and daughter to Mount Vernon in November 1786, was the key. Margaret worked as a spinner, washer, and milker. Her husband Daniel was a ditcher and a mower. Margaret and her family could speak little or no English when they arrived, and Washington then requested that they learn. So this is all sort of standard stuff at this point for these kind of contracts and these roles. Washington provided provisions and clothes for the family so that they could, in quotes, dress in a manner they liked best. He provided fresh vegetables that they could go and ask the gardener for, and meat from across the estate. Washington wanted to make them welcome, but he was a little disappointed that Daniel was not a skilled thatcher, as that is what he was hoping for. However, on hearing this, and to make up for her husband's deficiency, Margaret offered an alternative skill, and this is in quotes, making cheese according to the custom of her country, which comes very near to the mode of making English cheese by what I could learn from her, and this is being reported to Washington. So this female Atlantic migrant who moved as an indenture to live on a slave plantation taught Washington and the enslaved how to make cheese. These undiscovered, often unrecognized in exhibits and across plantations, but indispensable women who were rewarded and respected for their work, their new methods, in quotes, as one planter refers, their knowledge and their skills still have much, much more to teach us. So just to finish, and something, really something that happened last week. So in terms of Jefferson, indentures and servants also lived on his estate, as I'm sure many of you know, and they had wives too. And there were two I was looking at last week. And at Monticello, we find these indentured men and women, and they transition either into free people or servants and go on to be independent. So the Giannini family, I think, have become very well known in this area. And I've mentioned them not because they were indentures at Monticello, but because people may or may not know, when they migrated, they did migrate in 1773 as indentured servants. Maria Giannini was 26, her husband was a skilled gardener. They had a 2-year-old child, and they moved from Europe to America on an indenture contract and worked in a man named Mezzie's vineyards from 1773 to 78, and then they worked after they had ended their indenture for Jefferson from 1778 to 82. Now, that's not, I think it's quite common knowledge, and thankfully for me, somebody's written a history of the Giannini family. If you're interested, I've put up the front cover there. But what I really want to say beyond this, and there is a bit from the Monticello webpage, and it's about her husband, Antonio, and it's a timeline of the Giannini's time from arriving and then at Monticello. And again, it slightly suffers from the same problem. It's brilliant on one level, there's a lot of detail and it goes on. I just cut this off at 72 and tells us a lot, but the only mention of Maria at all is when she married her husband in 1770 in Italy. So just a small point. So to close then, and really as a thank you to those who work in the library for constantly helping myself and researchers and linking their projects, I want to finish with a moment in Monticello Library that demonstrates the importance of researching these women, talking, sharing, and making connections. Last Friday, Anna Burks, one of Monticello's amazing librarians, and Adrina too, of course, thank you, introduced me to someone visiting from Washington, DC. She was doing research into her enslaved descendants in Monticello. As we started chatting, we discovered immediately we had a link. The Dohertys, I think that's how you say it, a couple who were from Ireland and who were servants at Monticello. Joseph Doherty is quite well known as a coachman at Monticello. However, I'd noticed last week before this meeting, his wife, Mary, was being paid for her work as a servant, and I put her down actually on a scrap of paper that I couldn't find later to investigate, but it stuck in my mind. Anyway, during this conversation in the library last Friday, from someone visiting to trace their family, in particular their enslaved family, I found that Mary and Joseph Doherty had looked after the money that this woman's enslaved relatives used to buy their freedom. Obviously, this is a fascinating story and extremely interesting. So, placing women such as these, as I've described today, at the centre of the story of plantation slavery is a pivotal step if we are to provide a comprehensive history of the plantation and of slavery itself. And that's all I'm really going to say, but I'm going to leave the screen there just quickly for a moment of questions for you to think about, perhaps comment on, or maybe you can help me with my quest and fill me in with some things I don't know already in my research.
Laura, thank you very much indeed. I'm amazed as to how much you've accomplished in such a short time. I always think it's somewhat unfair to all our visiting fellows that they have to give talks when they have less than a month with us, and they are sometimes, like you, starting a project. Obviously, you'd done earlier work for your book on overseers, but this is all new ground, especially working on non-elite white women in the plantation. There's been some tradition for years working on enslaved women. And what is interesting about the new focus on white women on the plantations is there is a sort of new realism, because it's more difficult to just present them as victims and to be celebratory, although some books are, like Laurie Glover's book on Eliza Lucas Pinckney as a plantation owner, but I'm thinking particularly of Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, who did a book. They were her property, white women as slave owners in the American South. And hers is a very mixed picture. Some of these female slave owners were quite brutal. And I'm just wondering, what sorts of personalities and what is the span of personalities that you come across in looking at the non-elite white women?
Yeah, it's a good question, Andrew. And again, I haven't shied away of this. Obviously, some of them are terrible and brutal. Again, they're not mentioned as frequently as their husbands in records, and they're fleeting anyway, but when they are mentioned, it's often for what they're doing, their activity. And I don't know whether it's sort of not genteel to mention this, but it tends to be, it's mentioned if an enslaved person is affected in terms of the labour they'll do, or it's mentioned when other overseers or planters themselves are reporting on enslaved people complaining about this brutality. And so there's some really, you know, interesting incidents that come to light when a planter either feels that this is affecting labour or causing conflict, which obviously, you know, the humane side of us would think, well, there must be much more of this that could have been reported and is ignored. It's a bit like when overseers are brutal, but if they produce a good crop, which I've talked about for Jefferson, you know, we think that Gabriel Lilly was sort of sacked immediately, but he wasn't. He produced a few good crops, and then it was a combination of his violence and his you know, his other behaviour that sort of sent him, you know, on the road to being dismissed. But I think it's the same with the women. If they are productive and they're seen as good managers and supervisors, then that kind of violence could slide by. I haven't found that many very specific incidences, but that doesn't mean they're not there. What I will say is actually one of the things I was looking into was last week were some enslaved people complaining to Edmund Bacon, and well, they were complaining to Jefferson first and then to Edmund Bacon about another overseer. And I thought, oh, I wonder if that overseer's got a wife, because often when they do have a wife, the enslaved, both in a strategic and very smart way, and possibly because it's the reality, complain about both of them. You know, both this couple are atrocious, you need to get rid of them. You know, we can't do our job, we can't do our work, they're violent, you know, or they're punishing our children, the young slaves, that kind of thing. So it's a wife can be a target too. And in some cases that I've got, again, they're in my book and they're sort of a bit, they're not, again, I'm starting the research for Jefferson because I didn't do so much for my book because it sort of went, I couldn't go on forever. And I think most people would think I did go on forever in a sense, but the kind of manipulation of some of the networks, again, sort of pushes us towards thinking about enslaved resistance, and the extra person, the extra perhaps weak link, the overseer's wife, can be utilised by the enslaved to either gain what they want or to resist slavery. And there's some good examples of that going on, which again, I applaud strategically, getting past the overseer and the enslaved, sorry, the overseer's wife, if you can.
And that would be interesting to examine further, sort of psychologically, how when you just have an overseer, the relationship with the enslaved might be different, and you know, they're more dependent in some ways, more isolated. Obviously, it's notorious that the white male overseers and planters, for that matter, had children by enslaved women, but it's almost never the case the other way around, other than in very early Virginia with sometimes white indentured servants. Have you found that to be the case?
I can't find it, although now you're saying it, I did actually read something last week and I put a note, because as I'm going through and I'm seeing other things, I'm writing a note. And it literally sounded like an overseer, not an overseer, an overseer's wife had a sexual relationship with an enslaved person. I don't know if I read it wrong and I needed to look into it. Yes. But in terms of overseers' wives, I think on the plantation and those relationships, it's like finding a needle in the haystack. They don't want to be noted down for all sorts of reasons of, you know, gentility or, you know, undermining the idea of what womanhood is. But there's a bit of me, because I'm doing a project on slave stealing, and I have spent a lot of time looking at the idea of white women as thieves of slaves when they have sexual relationships with them, and then they run away. And I can't see why, if it happened in the in the sort of 17th and early 18th century. It didn't happen on the plantation that has gone uncommented. Perhaps it didn't get in the court records. I don't know. The other interesting thing, back to what you were saying about the husbands, some planters viewed the overseer's wife not just as a worker and a labourer, but of course that social role as a wife and a mother, as someone who would, and one planter put it exactly like this, that would make the overseer a house cat, someone who wasn't going to have a relationship with an enslaved person because they had a wife there. And of course that's not the case. It seems to be the case for the most part that everyone's so busy, but there are of course overseers who have wives and have enslaved people who they're in relationships with, likely coerced and possibly violent. So it's not a surefire thing, but it's something that planters in the 18th century mention in different ways, this sort of socializing role. And one planter forgives an enslaved overseer because he's visiting his fiance in South Carolina, and he says, oh, it's okay, you know what, you're visiting your fiance and you're not really doing anything else, so once she moves on to the plantation, I'm going to get a worker and someone to keep you at home.
So I realize actually we've got questions building up. I hadn't noticed. So this is from Jean-Baptiste Goyard, one of your fellows who's going to be speaking soon, linking this period with the ancient world. He says, thank you for this fascinating talk about this disregarded subject. Which age group were targeted or excluded by the plantation owners? Were there any conditions in some plantations, such as not being pregnant, like Mrs. Anne Bacon? What happened to them in old age when they could not be as productive, the planters?
Okay, there's 3 questions, I think, there. I'm going to try and remember them. But one is, I don't think there's a specific targeted age group. I think really young, generally men or women, are seen as less experienced, but if they've got perhaps a good family they come from, well-known farmer and a planter, and they've grown up that way. So for instance, some of the women I mentioned were in their 20s when they joined the plantation, and some of them were in their 40s. So I think there's an age range. I've not actually ever seen an overseer employed who's over 60. I'm sure it happened, but I don't think that is an age group. If women are doing work in their homes and off the plantation, these casual labourers, and I didn't talk about this as much because I haven't got as far with this, but I think there are older women there too. I don't think anyone in particular is excluded if they've got a use. These guys are just, ruthless profit maximising men who will take the most skilled people. Can you remind me of other questions? I think I've talked too much.
Right. Well, because we've got a number, and so let me just move on. Emily West, fellow Brit and another visiting fellow, says, no wonder enslavers wanted overseers with wives. They did so much typically gendered and unpaid labor, typically caring or domestic. And this is good. My question is about women who worked in dairies, smokehouses, or raised poultry. Were these places that provided food for white enslavers or for enslaved people, or both, if known? So I know that interests me, what white women, other than the planters' wives and the overseers' wives, might be working on a plantation, or maybe supplying a plantation.
So I think the ones living on the plantation, whether they're overseers or not, the artisans' wives, the workmen's wives, if they live there on anything from a month to 6 months or a year or beyond contract, they're producing all those kind of goods, vegetables, poultry, hogs, etc. that I mentioned. But they're producing clothes, producing candles sometimes, shoes. So there are couples who are both shoemakers, wool. So those kind of goods. But I think the other, back to the original point, is that those networks haven't really been explored enough in terms of the fact that women are exchanging goods all the time. And I said this about Martha Jefferson's account book, but you could map this out on a map, really, an actual map of all these different exchanges between enslaved women, enslaved overseers' wives, hired labourers who maybe come in and do a little bit of work, or who were given the work to take to their homes, overseers' wives, the plantation owner's wife, or enslaver. So I think one of those things is we need to explore all that, because all those things feed back into all the resources that aren't necessary for slavery on the ground, but some of them are being, exported off the plantation, or they're going to the neighbours. And there's some, good stuff in there of all these different people. And you wonder who encounters who physically encounters who, how much money is being made. And I think it can be, I say this, I love counting like Jefferson. I think it could be added up, but.
Well, here's hopefully what can be quite a quickly answered question, because we're pretty well out of time. And this is from John Ragosta. We know that there are instances of blacks being overseers. Are there instances of whites acting as overseers? So were the white women overseers?
Yes, definitely. So they're not overseers as of agricultural overseers in a sense, but my book is about the idea of overseeing as a bigger thing in big plantations. So supervising a group of slaves, anything from 2 to 5 to 6 to 10, could be the number in a field. So there are definitely overseers' wives who are solely, their job really is to supervise, not but their employers' enslaved people. And some women are brought onto the plantation. I've got some really good examples of women who are hired, they're single, they're unmarried, and they come on and they are supervising 5, 6 women and teaching them at the same time.
Excellent. Well, I think unless there's another question, we're right on the deadline. So thank you very much indeed. That's been informative and remarkable.
Great, thanks a lot, Andrew.
These are not easy. Well done.
JB, if you're still listening, I've remembered your question. I have the answer, but thank you to everyone who attended, and I will say goodbye.